everyone. Glad to have you here. I'm Liz Cohen. I'm Dean of the Radcliffe Institute for Advanced Study, and I'm delighted to welcome you to today's lecture by Jacob Hacker, the Stanley B. Resor Professor of Political Science at Yale. At Radcliffe, as many of you know, we bring together scholars, scientists, and artists to work on the cutting edges of their fields and across disciplinary boundaries. And then we are dedicated to sharing the fruits of that advanced work with broad public audiences in person and online. As an historian and dean here at this institute, I believe strongly in our mission to bring leading scholars and artists to Radcliffe Yard to carry out advanced work. But I have been reminded of that mission's importance even more keenly over the last month. In the wake of one of the most contentious presidential elections in my memory, I heard and saw many people looking for help in making sense of the campaign, the results, and the reality of our very divided nation. Radcliffe's twin commitments to supporting incisive scholarship on critical issues like the state of American politics, and then engaging the public in serious discussion and debate seem more urgent than ever. So I am very pleased that Jacob Hacker and all of you are here with us today. As pundits have scrambled to explain the victory of Donald Trump, one common analysis has emphasized resentment on the part of Americans who feel that the globalizing economy has left them behind. For example, the Portland Press-Herald in Maine interviewed an 80-year-old retired mill worker who had never voted for a Republican before, but who voted for Trump this time and said in his words, "Because Democrats used to be for the working class, I don't feel that anymore," end quote. There is good reason for many Americans like this mill worker to believe they are losing ground. Although the overall economy has been thriving in recent years and total wealth production is up, economic inequality has also been rising. The Economic Policy Institute, a nonpartisan research organization, reports that since the 1970s, real wages for the top 1% have risen 362%. Meanwhile, real wages for most workers have stagnated, and for many, they have actually fallen. The result is increased wealth concentration on the very highest rungs of the economic ladder, with a shrinking share left over for everyone else. In 2014, the wealthiest 20% of Americans owned more than 80% of all American wealth. In contrast, the wealth of the poorest 20% was negative, meaning that their debts exceeded the value of all of their assets. Things have not always been this way. In the decades following World War II, wealth in the United States grew and inequality shrunk at the same time. So what we are seeing now represents a fundamental change. Analysts across the political spectrum agree that it is a worrisome change. Even a conservative like Alan Greenspan, former chair of the Federal Reserve, appointed by President Ronald Reagan, calls the current levels of inequality, and I quote him, "not the type of thing which a democratic society, a capitalist democratic society, can really accept without addressing," end quote. Scholars of diverse political persuasions are asking related questions. Where is the dramatic increase in inequality coming from? Why is an economy that is producing more wealth than ever leaving people behind? What roles have government and private markets played in creating economic inequality? And what can and should they do to reduce it? More specifically, is government the cause or the remedy for our present ills? Critics differ, of course, in their explanations of how we got here and what can be done. Jacob Hacker is a political scientist who has dedicated much of his career to investigating just these questions and to seeking greater understanding of how political and economic leaders of different political perspectives have answered them. At the same time, he has developed his own analyses about the causes, consequences, and cures for the current American crisis. No subject could be more relevant or important today. In addition to teaching at Yale, Professor Hacker is the director of the Institute for Social and Policy Studies there, and he is also a frequent media commentator. Professor Hacker is the author or co-author of 5 books, including Winner Take All Politics, How Washington Made the Rich Richer and Turned Its Back on the Middle Class, which was a New York Times bestseller in 2010. He co-wrote that book with Paul Pierson, who is also the co-author on the book that Professor Hacker will talk to us about today, which is entitled American Amnesia, How the Warren Government Led Us to Forget What Made America Prosper. And if this lecture whets your appetite for more, let me tell you that there'll be a segment on tonight's PBS NewsHour on American Amnesia, and it will also be live streamed if you don't catch it tonight. So please join me now in warmly welcoming Professor Jacob Hacker.
Well, thank you. It's such a pleasure to be here. Thank you, Liz, for the introduction. I want to thank both the Beckys, Rebecca and Becky, for helping make it possible for me to be here today. Alex for the AV work she did. Hopefully it will work. She said if it doesn't, she's going to come running up here, so you'll all get to meet her. This is a setting that I'm really happy to be back in. I was a student at Harvard, spent also time here at the Harvard Society of Fellows. When I met many of the great scholars who are in the audience today, and I consider them friends, mentors, and now I'm fortunate to think of them as colleagues as well. So as Liz said, this is a moment for us to talk about what I see as a crisis. And it's not just a crisis of inequality, it's a crisis of American governance. And it's not, I also want to emphasize, a new development. And so up front, I just want to say that I see Donald Trump's victory and the Republicans' broader victory not as a sharp break with the past, but as a culmination of some fundamental trends in American politics and policy that I want to talk with you about tonight. I also just want to say how pleased I am to be able to be here at Radcliffe. I was a student when Radcliffe was still a separate institution, though moving towards this new status. My wife, Ona Hathaway, has both Radcliffe and Harvard on her diploma. We graduated together in 1994. And one of the things I'm going to be talking about today is the degree to which the active state in the mid-20th century increased our prosperity not by redistributing, not by taking from some and giving to others, but by opening up opportunities that made our economy vastly more productive, as well as vastly more fair. And that, I think, is really symbolized by the role that Radcliffe has played historically and continues to play today, and I'm honored to be able to be a small part of that institution. So I've already said a lot of thanks, and I want to keep them brief. I would really like to be able to have a larger conversation at the end. Whenever I'm in the position of needing to keep my remarks short, I'm reminded of an evaluation I received when I was a new assistant professor at Yale some years ago. And it began with great promise. It said, "Professor Hacker, if I had just 15 minutes to live, I'd want to spend it in your class." Because that way it would seem like an hour. So I hope the next 35 minutes or so of me speaking seems pretty close to the actual time. But I do want to offer one more thanks. Liz mentioned my co-author, Paul Pierson. He was a professor here, knows many of the same friends and colleagues I was talking about. And he's really been just a wonderful companion on a long, now long intellectual journey. And I know he would love to be here giving this talk, but he's a professor at UC Berkeley, so he actually has to teach. Okay. So this book, American Amnesia, was published a few months ago, and it's fair to say that I didn't expect Donald Trump to overshadow it quite the way he did. There's an old joke in publishing that the period before a book is published is the calm before the calm. But But this period has been anything but calm. And although it was frustrating to try to talk about what some of the longer-term trends in American politics at a time of fixation on an outsized personality, in a lot of ways, I think the book is more important than it was when we first formulated it. And so what I want to do is start by talking a little bit about what the argument of the book is. And then I want to turn more broadly to its implications for our understanding of contemporary American politics. Now, this picture on the cover, and I don't know how many of you saw the picture that was up previously that was a sort of the poster for this talk. It's really a wonderful picture. And it was actually an illustration that was done by the person who does the public relations here at Radcliffe. But this picture, yes, exactly, it's a grade. It sort of has a Hopper feel. But this picture, American Amnesia, a lot of people have said, well, what a great cover. How did you get that? How did you get that photoshopped with that wonderful fog there around the Capitol? And well, the reality is it is not photoshopped. This is the actual Capitol. And that next to the Capitol is the Capitol power plant. It is, or was, until it was decommissioned in 2009, the largest single source of carbon emissions in the DC area. And it was spewing coal ash out into one of the most disadvantaged neighborhoods in Washington, DC. Well, fortunately, it was taken offline in 2009. Unfortunately, this issue was raised for 30 years before that, and it was not until 2009 that it was taken down. And the reason, as you might guess, is that the senators from coal states were very much opposed to the symbolic act of taking away this great monument to American energy. And that's in some ways a very nice metaphor for the argument of this book as a whole. So it's not just Washington, D.C. If you go back to any city, this is Boston, 1969, the quality of air, and not to mention air and as well as water, at the time was abysmal, right? So this is Boston, 1969. And if you have, I have pictures of Manhattan and Detroit and almost Los Angeles. These cities were deadly. The level of pollution was such that there were, when bad air events, as they were sometimes called, happened, literally hundreds of people would die, and sometimes thousands. And the fact that we don't have such polluted air today is a reflection of wise policy that was taken around this time. In the early 1970s, the Clean Air Act was passed under a Republican president, Richard Nixon. And that act and the subsequent amendments, including the 1991 amendments under George H.W. Bush, dramatically improved the quality of air in our cities. And we know that this has made an enormous difference. And we know it from looking at another city. This city is not American, it's Beijing. And by comparing deaths in rural parts of China and deaths in Beijing, it's possible to back out rough estimates of how much life expectancy in the United States has been improved because of this massive improvement in air quality. And these were reported recently in the New York Times, and I adopt that chart. And you can see that the numbers are truly staggering. So a child born today, as opposed to the 1970s, could expect in one city in West Virginia to live for more than 5 years longer than his or her counterpart in the 1970s. And the average for the United States is around 2 years. But as you can see, there are these cities that are doing much better. And I'm particularly interested in the second one down, because as Theda Scotchbull here in the audience knows, she's been studying these two men quite a bit lately. This is the home of Koch Industries and Charles and David Koch, who of course are leading critics of active government and in particular environmental laws. But apparently, being against laws does not deprive you of the extra years of life you get from improved air quality. And these examples tell us, I think, two basic things. One is that government's regulatory and spending powers, the power of government to make people do things, can sometimes be used for enormous positive good. And the reason is, second, because government has distinctive capacities. Government, as I said, has the ability, and Jane Mansbridge has put this well, to exercise legitimate coercion, right? Through our democratic processes, we decide how to use government to overcome various kinds of collective action problems and others, failures of individual decentralized behavior that would otherwise make us poorer or hurt us in other ways. I have been searching for a way to describe this. The phrase that Paul and I use in the book is the mixed economy, but it's really not, that's not very evocative. So in our search, Paul remembered that one of his advisors, Charles Lindblom at Yale, had talked about the mixed economy as a hand. You have the nimble fingers of the market, right? They're very capable of moving quickly and adjusting. And of course, there are four of them doing lots of different things. But the other part of your hand that's very useful is your thumb, right? The strong thumb that can provide the counter pressure that you need. And while you wouldn't want to be all thumbs, right? That would be pretty awkward. You wouldn't want to be all fingers either, right? It's the fact that they can both work together, sometimes in opposition and sometimes in cooperation, that allows us to do all the great things that modern humans do with their opposable thumbs. And that metaphor, I think, really sums up our view that this is not a zero-sum conflict between markets and government, but rather a positive-sum bargain that involves, of course, an enormous amount of conflict and pressure, but also an enormous amount of positive-sum cooperation and interplay. And what's even more important, and what I want to emphasize, is that our nation's political leaders once understood this, perhaps not in the way that I've just articulated, but were very clear that you needed an active, energetic, and yes, sometimes coercive government to achieve prosperity. Our founders understood it. The greats of economics, like Adam Smith, understood it. And our leaders of the 20th century in particular, when American prosperity was built, definitely understood it. Today, as I'm afraid is quite clear in the weeks since the election, many of our leaders do not understand this. And this forgetting, active and inadvertent, is what I want to talk about today, this amnesia. So as I said, the two things that I want to emphasize in discussing the argument of the book is, first, that this is a culmination of long-term trends, and second, and this is equally important, that we need to have a mixed economy. We need to have fingers and thumbs working together today, perhaps more than ever. And I believe we can rebuild a mixed economy, a new kind of mixed economy for the 21st century. So I want to talk about why I still have hope for that at the end of this, at this talk. So let's take ourselves back in time. Say to the beginning of the post to 0 AD, basically, right? So this is a long time frame. And fortunately, because of the work of Angus Maddison and his collaborators, we now have a pretty good idea of what standards of living were in some countries, in this case, the United Kingdom, and starting later, the US, for a very long periods of time. And if you look at these figures, what is really striking is that the line was essentially flat for most of modern human history. That jump occurs in the late 19th, early 20th century, and it's dramatic, right? I mean, the degree to which we went from being poor, very unhealthy, as I'll show in a moment, and very badly educated, to being rich, healthy, and very well educated is almost impossible to overstate. And this was not a kind of natural market development. Perhaps most important in it was the development of the capacities and skills of workers, and the public sector was deeply involved in this. I'm often struck when you hear talk about where growth comes from, that the group that gets most of the attention is the people at the top, the job creators, as we're told. But if you look at why the United States is so much more prosperous than other affluent other countries and why it got so much more prosperous, it's really the degree to which mass workers were able to become much more capable and productive that drove this development, and that had a lot to do with education. So it is not the case that, as Eric Cantor put it, on Labor Day we should be celebrating the businesses, because of course everyone knows Labor Day was set aside to honor entrepreneurs. It is that we should really be understanding the insight that Claudia Golden and Lawrence Katz provided us with in showing us that the United States was really the pioneer in the development of education. And Theda Scotchwell has written very well about the degree to which this continued. We went from being mass universal K through 12 education, the first country with universal high schools, and then, of course, a world leader in college, thanks in large part to the GI Bill. And that continues well into the 1970s with massive investments in public higher education, especially state universities. So that is one part of this story, and it's probably the most important part. Another part is the advancement of science and technology, which is tied up with this development. And as far back as Thomas Jefferson, people understood that there was a real market failure when it came to creating the kind of public knowledge, the technology and techniques like calculus that underpin our modern knowledge-intensive economy. And you can really see the American role in this by looking at Nobel Prizes. So starting in the mid-20th century, and particularly during and after World War II, the United States came to essentially own the field in the Nobel Prize area. And they owned the field because they owned the field in investment in research and development, science and technology. It didn't hurt, of course, that lots of Europeans were also fleeing fascist Europe and coming to the United States. But we really continued that because of the investments we made in research and development. Just to give you a sense of just how huge this was, at the end of World War II, the United States federal government was spending more on research and development than all businesses and governments in the rest of the world combined. And we've unfortunately fallen quite a bit, as we have in other areas. Okay, so the last thing I want to emphasize, and I've already touched on this, is that this was not a zero-sum story, that growth was not something where one group was really giving up a lot to let others prosper. Of course, I'm not downplaying the role of class conflict and redistribution in the history of American economic development, but if you go back to, say, the 1920s and look at the graduating class of the Harvard Business School, you will see that a lot of potential in society is not being tapped, right? Here, all the diversity here is facial hair. And so one of the things that both the opening up of education to women and minorities and job opportunities did was vastly increase the capacity of American society to draw on these dispersed talents. There was a recent study that estimated that about a fifth of total economic growth in the United States between 1960 and 2000 was due simply to increased opportunities in the labor market for women and minorities. So I said that this wasn't just about income, but also about health. And here I think there's an equally dramatic statistic we can look at. And indeed, in this case, we can go back, but not quite as far, to the 1500s. But as you'll see, the story is just as dramatic if we do that. So the first thing to say is, right, that life expectancy did not start to rise dramatically until the 19th century and really the late 19th and early 20th centuries. And again, we're looking at the United States when it sort of enters the picture in the 19th century. But the other thing to say is the spikes here, right, which are not wars, but major diseases and plagues and famines, and the the fact is that if you look, the people who lived in, say, British Victorian era did not have much longer life expectancies than people who lived in, say, ancient Greece. And that's a pretty remarkable fact. It's really the 20th century when we see these massive increases in life expectancy and all of these other measures of health, declining infant mortality, increased ability in older age, and so on. And this, again, was not some kind of natural development, as I think it's often seen. For example, the big spike that occurs early on here is due almost entirely to declines in infant mortality, and that, in turn, is due almost entirely to public health efforts that are taking place at the local level. I just read a really fascinating article that shows not only that these public health efforts were highly important in improving life expectancy, but that were driven by the mobilization of women's groups in these areas, a kind of continuation of the story that Theda Skocpol tells in her book, Protecting Soldiers and Mothers, about mothers' pensions. So there was a political story behind this. It was a story of enlarged participation by women. It was a story of greater responsiveness of local and state and national elites to ordinary citizens, but it resulted, and there was, of course, a development of science, the germ theory of disease, which postdates the early public health efforts, but is at the heart of a lot of the later work that's done. And so this goes to the expansion of insurance and medical technology and clinical practice, right? The great divide that we cross in the early 20th century is not just one of income and health, it's also a shift from being worse off if we saw a doctor to being better off. So there's a great quote from one of the presidents of Harvard where he says, you know, a random patient seeing a random doctor for a random condition did not, until this period, have more than a 50-50 chance of benefiting from the encounter. Now, it's not 100% today, but it's a lot better. And this wasn't the only thing. It wasn't just medical care. It wasn't just insurance. It was also an enormous expansion of things that are protecting people against themselves. And this, I know, is a hard subject to take up. It reeks a little bit of paternalism. But the fact is that the decline in smoking and the improvement in auto safety, which often involved requiring people to have safety measures, was also enormously important in this story. So this is the smoking picture, right? So the Surgeon General's report and the anti-smoking efforts of this period make an enormous difference. Just recently there was some controversy over the concussion scandals within the NFL, and the New York Times revealed that the NFL had been using some of the same lawyers that the tobacco industry used, which led to the following quote from the NFL. My colleague, Paul Pierson, says, "When the NFL says you're bad, you're really bad." Okay. And this is the same story with lead, which the decline of lead in the decline of lead in our cities, which improves cognitive function, is probably implicated in the decline in crime. When we talk about Flint, we say, "Oh my God," you know, and it is just a horrible regression. But the fact is that in the 1970s, large portions of preschool kids had lead levels much higher than those that we see in Flint. For example, a lot of people think that 5 microgram per deciliter is kind of like the upper limit that you should be exposed to. And as you can see, in the mid-70s, your average preschool kid was exposed to something like 5 times that. Okay, so this is the story of how we got so much richer and healthier. So what is the story of how this came undone? Because it has come undone. In area after area that we write about in the book, we are no longer leading the pack. The example that I find in some ways, and I'm just going to skip over this, but the example that I find in some ways most revealing is that Americans used to be the tallest people in the world by a very large margin. We were much taller at the time of the Revolution. We were taller than the Europeans at the time of World War II. but we're not the tallest people in the world. And this is true even if you look at people who are native-born white Americans. So this is the US trend, and these are basically cohorts, right, when you're born. Here's the Netherlands. My wife's family is from the Netherlands. Whenever I go over there, I realize just how short I am. And you can see, well, there's your average Dutch build and your average American build, and there is a difference. Germans have done a little better, a little less well than the Dutch, but in general, basically, we have ceased to be this kind of towering people at the same time as we've fallen behind on these other measures. Okay, so I very briefly want to say a bit about what underscored this and how it fell apart. And the crucial point that I want to make is that there was a political and economic coalition of business leaders and moderate Republicans that was at the heart of the success of the mixed economy. In some ways, you can tell the story as a transformation from one Romney to another. From George Romney, the governor of Michigan, who was an auto manufacturer, to Mitt Romney, we all know who Mitt Romney is, so yeah, I can move more quickly than that. So what is the nature of this transformation? I mean, after all, they're both Republicans of blue states, they're both relatively moderate within their own parties, and they both have a private sector business experience. Well, one of the most fundamental differences, right, is that George Romney comes from the manufacturing world, right? And he himself is very clear that there needs to be a great deal of equity within the workplace, and he's supportive of unions. At the same time, George Romney is opposed to the Goldwater conservatism. And at the time, so if you think of Mitt Romney, right, he's coming out of the finance world, the world of Bain Capital, which is much more about slicing and dicing companies and about shorter-term economic gains. So if you think about these two figures, right, as business leaders, as we discuss in the book, the transformation of the business community, both the organizations that represent it and business leaders' own orientation toward the mixed economy are really transformed over this period by financialization and by changes in organized business leadership. So this man, Tom Donahue, is the head of the Chamber of Commerce. The Chamber of Commerce, under his leadership, has gone from being kind of a staid, moderate business organization to being closely allied with Republicans and much more of a lobbying shop for parochial private sector interests. This, after all, is what the sign on Tom Donahue's desk reads, "Show me the money." And as Theda Skocpol has very carefully shown, the other major business group that has become much more powerful, besides the Chamber of Commerce, is the Koch network. And the Koch network is, of course, is not so much parochial in this way, but it's very extreme ideologically. And it's probably roughly equal in size or even larger to the Chamber of Commerce. Now, one feature of this development that I want to emphasize is that it takes us back, in a sense, to an older, more feudal economy. And this is the Rhine River. These are the castles on the Rhine that the robber barons, as they were called, used to basically block commerce and take tolls. Thus shutting down European trade in the 1500s. And in many ways, today's business associations and top corporate leaders are much more operating in a world where they're able to use market power and political power to skim off the top. As Liz was talking about before, the rise in inequality is driven in substantial part by what's happening at the top, and there's more and more evidence that this is about, in many cases, rent-seeking. That is, above-market returns that are a result of political power. So, for example, in our healthcare sector, right, where we spend vastly more than other people, other countries, right, we're spending much more for mediocre results. There's enormous evidence, right, that the lobbying activities and market power of private actors, from providers to pharmaceutical manufacturers, is at the heart of the degree to which our costs are so high. And those costs, of course, are an enormous reason for the squeeze on other parts of our budget. The other big change that is reflected in this transformation is a transformation of the ideology of the Republican Party. So if the business world has become more financialized and its organized representatives have become either more mercenary or more extreme, the Republican Party has become much more conservative. And I don't think this is particularly controversial at this point, but I just want to make clear that part of this conservatism, right, it goes in hand with this, with some solicitousness towards these corporate interests, but it's also an anti-government ideology that is quite explicit about seeing government as the problem, as Ronald Reagan put it. And more than that, the strategies of this movement have been much more focused around obstruction and making it difficult for government to act. So in a lot of ways, the strategies of first Newt Gingrich and Mitch McConnell have basically been fomenting anti-government sentiment, in part by making it very difficult to govern. You see this again and again, and what is particularly important to understand here is that the mixed economy rested heavily on the ability to form kind of moderate bipartisan compromises. And as late as the early 1990s, you still saw those forming. But this twin move of the Republican Party towards both a more conservative ideology and a more obstructionist stance has made it much harder to use government in a positive way. Now, in my conclusion, I want to talk just a little bit about the current leadership. And I just want to say, let the record show that I've spoken for about 50 minutes and have really not mentioned Donald Trump yet. So that's quite an achievement, I think. So, and in fact, I want to talk not about Donald Trump first. I want to mention Paul Ryan. So Paul Ryan is, and this, if you look at this, these are from D-nominate scores. So ignore this dimension. Just think about this. This is a dimension that goes towards more conservatism. Ryan is quite a bit more conservative than Boehner. Boehner, by the way, was on the right edge of his party when he came into Congress. And of course, he then became first a kind of centrist within his own party, and then actually fairly moderate relative to these Freedom Caucus members who are the most conservative wing. Ryan is much more comfortably within that, and put aside his expressed enthusiasm for the writings of Ayn Rand. I mean, if you look at the Ryan budgets that have come out year after year, they have involved three central elements: massive tax cuts that are not really funded in the future and thus will devastate the federal budget. Disproportionate, where the cuts are made, disproportionate cuts for the poor. And finally, dismantling of key core parts of the social insurance state, notably the movement of Medicare away from a guaranteed benefit towards a voucher that it will, over time, erode relative to the cost of medical care. There's no sign that Paul Ryan has changed his view on these fundamental issues. In fact, before the election, in a moment that was kind of missed by many commentators, Paul Ryan got up there and said, here's what we're going to do. We're going to pass all this stuff through the reconciliation process. If we have a Republican president, that's the budget process that can't be subject to a filibuster. If we have a Republican president, he'll sign it. Well, now they do, and I think he will, certainly on many of the proposals that fall short of restructuring of Medicare, which is where I think there would be the most pushback. But the other thing I want to say about the continuation of these trends with the contemporary Republican Congress is that the other key figure is Mitch McConnell. Mitch McConnell, in my view, and as we argue in the book, has sort of cracked the code of American politics. He realized that in our political system, it was possible to foment distrust in American political institutions. And the levels of distrust that we see today are truly remarkable, right? We've never seen public trust so low. And I really think we should not go too deeply in trying to understand some of the core elements of this election, right? There was dissatisfaction with many aspects of where our country is going. The party in power had been in power already for 8 years, and people don't believe in government. They've been pressing the mad as hell button every few elections, right? And things have not been getting better, and they're mad as hell again. Now, the coalition behind that was different. And the response, unfortunately, I think will be quite different than what many of those pressing the mad as hell button want. But I think it's very much a continuation of these trends. So in my last remarks, I just want to say a little bit about why I think we should nonetheless believe that there is prospect for a mixed economy for the 21st century. And at the end of the book, Paul and I say there's good news and there's bad news. And since I've been talking about a lot of bad news, I'll start with the good news. And the good news is that there is a lot of money on the table. There are a lot of positive sum bargains we're not making. I mean, perhaps we will seize on some of them. I am very doubtful about the Trump infrastructure proposals, but that's certainly an area in which we have massively been underperforming because of lack of investment. So it's unfortunately, I say unfortunately, because I think that the Trump infrastructure proposals, as they've shaped up, look very much like privatization of public assets with little really positive long-term benefit. But the truth is that there are many areas in health, in economic inequality and security, in infrastructure and research and development, where we have not been making the investments that we should. And if we did, we would witness significant economic growth, and it would be broadly shared. So that's the good news. And I also think another piece of good news is that I think it's completely compatible with our broad political institutions to achieve that goal. But the bad news is that it's going to be hard. And that's what it's hard. It's not something that people want to hear. There is no magic bullet. We're not going to reverse these trends simply by reducing lobbying or eliminating Citizens United. We're going to have to do three things, and they're as difficult as they are easy to articulate, right? First, we have to get government moving again and working. If it doesn't work, then this doom cycle, this doom loop of dysfunction we've been seeing continues. Second, we have to increase mass pressure on elite organizations, and labor unions are facing a mass extinction event, right? Where will that pressure come from? We need to think about that, and we need to be part of that. And finally, we have to encourage cross-pressure among elites. We need Silicon Valley standing up, right, and speaking out for the degree to which the political economy that we need to create for the 21st century to be a thriving knowledge economy is threatened by these developments. You know, it's a huge issue, and it was really in this election we saw it. Prosperity is increasingly concentrated in urban knowledge centers where these agglomeration effects created by technology are greatest. And that prosperity has not been shared broadly. It is the future of our economy, but it's a future that all Americans need to be part of. So we have the grounds for growth, and we know what the basic formula is. And I actually think that given what I've just said, there's a very large prospect that the current political regime will overreach and create opportunities for that kind of building of a long-term movement for effective governance. But it's not going to happen unless we recognize how deep the problem is and how fundamental the role of government is in creating our prosperity. Or as Paul Pierson and I put it at the end of our book quite succinctly, the government that governs best has to govern quite a bit. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Ann with Horn. I was professor at UMass Boston, done a lot of work on welfare, poverty, social movements. And I think what you said is very important, and there's nothing bad about it. It's actually good. But I'm missing some things.
Okay.
I'm missing race.
Yeah.
Racism, racial differences, organizing around race, and then race in a global perspective. I mean, we are the British Empire, which is losing in the sense of global racial power. And I think some of this stuff is connected to that in different ways. It's ideology, it's identity, it's all those things, but you didn't really talk about that. And that, to me, is something you could talk about.
Yes, I totally agree.
And I'm sure you probably do in the book. I haven't read what you've been doing lately, but that's important. And I think that to give a talk like this, you need to an audience that's maybe a little tougher than this audience might be, and certainly darker. You need to be starting out by saying, who's in those Cadillacs? Where's that? Where's the whiteness? Where's the black people? Where's the color? Otherwise, you sound like you don't care and don't know. I think you do. I don't have any reason to think you don't. But it's right now not the time to have people assume that. You got to show that, man. Or people will just write you off or think you're just one more cover-up. Okay, quickly, the second thing is, back in the 80s here in Massachusetts, we got worried at the early version of all the private stuff. And we had this wonderful little newsletter called the Privateer News, which human services types and some of the business people, because people were about welfare reform and then everybody getting into the labor market. I mean, it wasn't a really radical organization, but it said what's happening is that the privateers are winning. I mean, those are the same people who brought us imperialism. And the interesting piece was that at that point, what happened was the business people that were supposed to be helping us ran for cover. They didn't want us to call it a privateer news. I know I got to shut up. But I think that talking very directly and with moral persuasion about it won't happen unless people stop saying private isn't better. It can't just be another model. And I'm going to shut up. I see you. Okay? But it's an important talk.
Well, I completely take your first point, and I must say that it's always shocking to discover how much slower you are when you give a talk than you were in your mind when you were writing it. So I actually did have to admit a little bit of a discussion of this really important dimension. Though I also think it's fair to say, looking back at the book, and I recognized it at the time we were finishing it up, that it says much less about race than it should. So let me say a little bit about how I think that fits in. Well, so first of all, I mean, one cannot deny the degree to which American politics has shifted to onto a racial axis, or returned might be the better way to put it. There is a lot of writing in discussing this election about class and differences of class, and I think that there is some evidence that of a certain kind of class differences. Whites without a college degree definitely were much more strongly Republican in this election than they have in recent elections, but that was a difference in degree, not kind. I think what was really striking to me was the degree to which this election became much more explicitly racialized than anyone I've seen in my lifetime. And the patterns of voting, of course, reflected that. I mean, people right after the election were talking about how, Clinton just didn't bring out African Americans and Hispanics. I mean, as I'm looking at these numbers, and the turnout is one issue, but in terms of the rates of support, especially among Hispanics, it's just remarkable. It's quite clear they understood what Donald Trump was saying and the threat that he posed to people with brown skin. So the way in which it fits into our larger story, I think, is twofold. One we talk about, and another we should have talked about. So one we talk about is the way in which this idea of the state as this agent of redistribution, which I think is very common among both liberals and conservatives, really misses the way in which government policies create these kind of positive sum bargains. The degree to which, right, bringing African Americans fully into our economy was vastly wealth producing for the economy as a whole, and of course for those who were able to, for the first time, become part of the American dream. And at a time, of course, where that dream was just about to hit the rocks. But the language of redistribution on the right is the language of makers and takers. And there's no question that image, as lots of work has shown, is a highly racialized image. So there's a reason that Medicare and Social Security, which are seen as predominantly helping upstanding, hardworking white Americans, are not viewed as part of this miasma of welfare dependency. And there's a reason as well that Donald Trump and his supporters saw the campaign oriented the campaign around immigration and the changing complexion of the country. And I think that we just cannot understand the way in which distrust of government has risen in the United States without understanding that it partly represents a very fundamental backlash against the changing demography of our country and and the changes in status, if not economic well-being, that entails. The side of it that we didn't say anything about, which I've gotten more interested in, is, we basically like government, right? We see it as distorted in many ways, and the irony is that we think that there's on the right people talk, I think correctly, about crony capitalism, and then they say the cure is to essentially cut back, eliminate government. It's like a form of bloodletting, right? If we cripple government, then it can't be used for these purposes, right? And side, and so we're basically saying, let's take back government for the positive purpose that our founders understood, Adam Smith understood, and the leaders of the 20th century understood. But there is a predatory state, right, that is, and its orientation towards African Americans in particular, right, does not look this benevolent at all. And look at the Ferguson report to see that in action, right? And I think that we, Paul and I, in writing this book, really just did ourselves a disservice by not thinking more about how this fits into the larger picture. After all, this decline in trust in government and in the presence of the state in a positive way in our economy occurs simultaneously with the rise of mass incarceration and the rise of these very punitive and extractive practices that were revealed in the Ferguson report. So I plead guilty that we didn't do more on that, and I'd love to get your thoughts about how it could be better incorporated. So next question.
Hi, I'm Jane Mansbridge, and I teach at the Kennedy School. I completely buy your positive sum story. Toward the end, you said that a mixed economy depends on the ability to make bipartisan compromises.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering what to do then, because there are large numbers.
It depends on unicorns.
Three major structural reasons why we're not going to get that. First of all, Johnson signed the Civil Rights Act back in 1964. The Southern conservatives left the Democratic Party. Now you've got two much more homogeneous parties, and they are acting like homogeneous conflicting parties. They're not making deals. You can't find someone across the aisle who thinks the way you do anymore. And then two, as you know, Nolan McCarty has got this wonderful graph that shows that, you all know that inequality has got this great U-curve. It turns out that polarization has got a U-curve that maps absolutely onto it. So there's a suggestion that inequality, now he's gotten more detailed, and he can begin to show that inequality causes polarization to some degree. I don't see inequality turning around tomorrow. That means that polarization is not going to turn around either. And then Frances Lee has got this point in which she says that as elections become more competitive, there's no reason for the party that's the minority to go along the way they did back in the days that we consider the wonderful old bipartisan days. They were really days of Democratic dominance. And so if you were a Republican, it kind of paid you to not be too obstreperous because you weren't going to get your roads and bridges. But as soon as you think you've got the eye on the next election, you think you can actually make it in the next election, then it's in your interest to keep the party in power from doing anything. Because then they'll run on their successes. If you can keep them from doing anything, just the way you can then say, look.
Okay, I got it, Jane.
Exactly.
It's
all
really
right.
bad.
So now what do we do? That's my question.
Okay. So, I mean, the first thing to say is absolutely, and one wonders if bipartisan is the wrong word to use in this context, given, as you say, the degree to which the parties have become more homogeneous and distinct. It may well be that what I'm talking about, the kind of compromise, if you will, that I'm talking about is much more about creating effective majorities that are representing the broad middle of the American electorate. And that's not what we've had. I mean, the way to understand, and this is not an original thought, this is contained in the work of Tom Mann and Norm Ornstein and Theta's work and others, is that we basically are developing more unified parties, although not unified always in the way that we typically would think of parties. It doesn't. The Republican Party in recent years has both been highly unified in its voting patterns and highly fractious as well in terms of its leadership choices. But we have unified parties of an almost parliamentary style in a separation of powers system. And if you go back to the writing of Juan Linz and other theorists of parliamentary versus presidential system, that's a really bad combination, right? It leads to instability. It leads to the potential for a sort of authoritarian to come to power, promising he can break through the gridlock. I would never think that could happen. And it also is very hard to hold parties accountable, which is, after all, right, the ideal of sort of party government, right, was that one party is in power, and based on the performance of the economy and other things, you can decide whether you should keep them. Are you better off than you were 4 years ago? In our system, who's in charge when the president presidency is held by one party and Congress or one branch of Congress is held by the other. I mean, that is, as I say, part of the reason why the backlash against Republicans could be quite consequential, because there is a much more unified accountability than there has been recently. So what does it require to create sort of more pressure for moderate outcomes, which might be, and in irony, I think our book is basically saying we need radical change to create moderate outcomes, which I know is not a rallying cry that many people are going to get behind. Well, I think the big thing we shouldn't forget is that, first of all, pressure from the edges, and particularly in the US, given the weakness of the left relative to the organized right, is an important part, right, of pulling people to the center. A second thing I would mention is that I think is very important and somewhat neglected is that, I've never seen a case in American history where elites just sort of decide they're going to, out of the goodness of their heart, that they're going to come to some kind of compromise that's positive sum. It always happens because of constraint. The mid-century business elite wasn't just the greatest generation of business leaders. They had to face organized labor. They had to deal with moderate Republicans. So how do you create constraint? If it's not going to come from labor, where does it come from? What kind of organizations? I mean, as a very sort of important starting point, right, you can't expect that just you could have a strategy for winning elections that involves being in just a few places in the country, because you have to create ongoing constraint on governance. That means, the Democratic Party has to be a 50-state party, as is often said. It means that organization, the Democrat on the left can't just be in Washington, right? They have to be federated, as Theda has argued in much of her work. Lastly, and this is, I think, kind of cuts against the grain of some of the political science consensus, but I want to say it. I think that our low levels of turnout, and particularly the disparities between midterm and presidential election years, is an enormous part of the problem here. And that to get more people engaged in politics on a sustained basis, not just voting, but as a gateway to other forms of organization, voting, and especially in midterm years, would make a tremendous difference. And it would make a difference in part because it would create much greater chance of the kind of accountability that I was talking about, right? Not the kind of essentially you get 2 years, right? And then the other party is going to crush you. And let's just be clear. There's an asymmetry between the parties and how this system works, because the Republican Party has become the party of low turnout election years. It's become the party of older, whiter voters. That didn't used to be the case, and rural voters. That didn't used to be the case. Now, a Democratic presidency and Congress has 2 years before a midterm wipes it out. And with the Republican Party, they don't have that same conflict, right? And the only way we're going to create that conflict is if there's high turnout on both sides in non-presidential election years. Next question.
June Zakara with the Global Development and Environment Institute at Tufts, and where we have recently launched a project on the public economy.
Wonderful.
Something that doesn't exist in economics. And I actually spent 25 years of my life or more in government at the federal, state, and local levels.
That's great.
In management and leadership positions. And I watched basically the marketization of government at all three levels that happened, all three levels as I worked at them. And what we have is a government that's been taken over by the economic market model, and the religion, the ideology of market economics has basically permeated government and is the rationale by which much of government is run. So what I read your book, and I really want to say that I'm very appreciative that you talk about how redistribution, how so many think of government as just a major role as redistribution, and it does very much more. But my question is, you talk about the mixed economy, and that term, which many people use, sort of leaves the question hanging, a mix of market and what? Mm-hmm. And so what I have been working on, and others, and is in my recent book on the public economy in crisis, is that there are multiple economies. There's the market economy, and there is the public non-market economy. Mm. And we need a theory of the public non-market economy, which we are working on.
Great.
But I wondered if you had thought about that, the term mixed economy, and also the question of, the thumb versus the fingers. Yeah. I mean, the government is actually, the public economy is actually a producer. Paul Strudensky wrote about this in the 1920s very eloquently, as government as a producer.
Yeah.
So I wondered if you would talk about that, and you and your co-author, and whether you had any thoughts about, the mixed economy versus there being a market, there being a public economy.
Yeah, thank you so much. Yeah, and I'm so glad that this project is taking place. And I do think that, as a very first kind of gloss on what you were saying, I think we definitely are not suggesting that a mixed economy simply consists of market and government, right? There's a huge nonprofit voluntary sector as well, and we shouldn't forget the way in which the economy rests on the economy of households as well. So I agree with that. I think I think that this is the best metaphor I've heard, but it does have this problem that it suggests that the role of government is mostly kind of pushing back and regulatory, and that's not at all what we're saying. I mean, a lot of what I was talking about was kind of the fuel for the engine of prosperity, and in fact, the big problem I see is that we're not actually replenishing that tank, and so we're kind of going to be running on fumes more and more. If we look at the digital economy and the breakthroughs that resulted, there were 1950s and 60s investments, and where are we making those investments today? In some areas, but far too little and far too late. So what I would say about the productive side and marketization is, and if we could just pull up this slide that I put up here. So this is the chart that I just found it today that sort of shows why everything we think we know about the federal government is wrong. So the federal government is spending a lot more than it used to, but in terms of civilian employment, right, it's basically been relying increasingly on third-party contractors and privatization, right? So this is total civilian employment, right, as a share of the workforce. And I think we point out in the book that to get back to sort of Eisenhower level era levels, and John DiIulio has pointed this out, you'd have to hire like 2 million federal workers tomorrow, right? And right now, Donald Trump is proposing a freeze on federal hiring, which continues a kind of Republican call. And what happens in the absence, and we can see this too in congressional committee staff, which, as our society grew much more complex and Congress's role in legislating increased, there was this enormous increase in committee staff. This comes from the work of Lee Drutman. And in recent decades, of course, really centering around the rise of Newt Gingrich and the Republican capture of Congress, there's been a dramatic decline. And the result is, at the same time, of course, there's just been enormous outside spending, right? This is a world in which the one side has essentially weaponized, right, and the other side is disarmed. And not having an effective public sector in that context leads to precisely these kind of dynamics. I think this, to me, is probably the most kind of likely evolution of the American mixed economy under Donald Trump. There's going to be this kind of cutback right conservative move that will be centered around Ryan. But to the extent that Trump himself is putting his imprint on an economic policy, I think it's going to be much more around these kinds of opportunities for private profit through public power. And some of it will be his own profit. And there's times when that actually can work. If you think about the post-war era and the sort of what's sometimes called the military-industrial complex, but really was the military-industrial academic complex, when you use decentralized means and competition to, like, for example, design weapon systems or to come up with new research and development ideas or do basic science, it can work extremely well. But it's not an area where the kind of profit motive is really the fundamental source of pressure. And what we see in this state predation I was talking about is, like, what's happened in Ferguson was all about creating opportunities for the private sector essentially to extract from citizens, right, who became essentially indebted to for-profit industries that preyed on them thanks to the opportunities that government created. And government was collecting a few pennies on the dollar of this private predation. So there is a way in which we have to keep this metaphor in mind, because the thumb isn't just about pushing back in regulatory terms or pushing for investment. It's also about disciplining and holding back the power of market actors to subvert the political process. I mean, that is the fundamental dialectic of a democratic capitalism. And to me, if there's one kind of message that comes out of this, is that you need to have a state that's strong enough to resist the kind of the inevitable concentrations of economic power that result in a capitalist economy, which is not an anti-capitalist position. It's essential for making capitalism work. Yeah, so next question.
Hi, my name is Lucas. I'm just a citizen of Massachusetts.
No. That's great.
So two things, I guess. One is what's driving this amnesia, right? Is it really just all politics? Is it a Republican strategy to sow distrust in government? Is that really it? Or maybe I guess the second component is what does media play? How does media play a role? Sure, we've all heard about the fake news epidemic and how that's been sort of creating echo chambers, especially on social media among conservatives. In fact, just not factual statements being promulgated across the internet and being taken as truth, and how that factors in all this. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Yeah. Well, so I want to be clear. I mean, one of the strange things about this book is that Paul and I have gotten a lot of pushback from people who say that we're too much focused on ideas, right? Which is something I've never been accused of, right? I mean, you just saw this whole talk about, organizations and political movements. But I do think there is a cultural shift that we're talking about that is reflective of elite organization and investment, and probably is also reflective of broader changes in our society that, say, Daniel Rogers writes about in his book, The Age of Fracture, towards a greater emphasis on individualism. But one thing I would say is that kind of individuation, personal, a sense of kind of personal empowerment is compatible with a lot of different and better models of capitalism, right? So it gets channeled into this much more kind of dog-eat-dog, limited government ideology. So I just want to say a word about the media, because I think that's a really interesting and important question. And in the book, we talk a lot about the sort of the way in which Fox News and talk radio really drove the kind of increasing intensification of the Republican base, which in turn fed into the way in which the GOP shifted right over time. And you really can't overstate the role. It's not that Fox News is like convincing a lot of swing voters to vote for Republicans. There's a little evidence that when it is introduced into media markets that it pulls candidates to the right. But the real story, right, is the degree to which it becomes a kind of vehicle, and this was true in the Tea Party's rise, a vehicle for mobilizing and focusing the energy of conservative activists. And ordinary citizens who are intense and willing to get out there. The Tea Party was a remarkable organization, and once again, I drew a lot on Theta's work, and thinking about it, it's a remarkable organization that it is a decentralized, federated organization that has lots of mass input. I mean, there is something there that we should understand for building broader organizations, but one piece of it that is very hard to think about how you would replicate it elsewhere is the way in which Fox News and conservative talk radio plays a kind of amplifying role in that world. The mainstream media, as we sometimes call it, has really not done us a very good job, to put it bluntly, to put it mildly. So the two things that I think about the media here, one is that as Dan Rather was once asked what the goal of the nightly news was, and he said to survive, right? That they're under enormous competitive pressure and they're declining. Lots of people have tuned out from the mainstream media, and the media is in a tailspin. And in fact, to the extent that it's been able to hold on in recent years, it's by doing a kind of conflict-oriented, horse race-oriented, hyperventilation kind of coverage that doesn't really inform people very much. And that is, I'm not saying that the media was once, like a civics lesson, right? But the degree to which people are getting important information about policy or other features of public affairs from the media has really declined. The other thing the media does is reinforce this kind of negative view of government. And there's a headline you'll never see. It's "Things are getting better slowly because of government," right? I mean, it's just like your eyes are already your eyelids are already drooping. But that's the truth in a lot of areas. But we have looked at a lot of studies of media coverage, and the negativity bias, particularly around public policy, is really an important reason why people don't understand some of the positive benefits of public policy. So I wouldn't put too much emphasis on it, but I do think, especially in terms of ginning up the right, it's been really fundamental. Thanks, Lucas.
Hi, my name is Jonathan Gantz. I'm also a member of the public. First of all, thank you very much for the talk.
Thanks, Jonathan.
So you mentioned at some point in your talk, or I think it was early, you said the institutions we have are effective. But you've obviously talked about some problems, and we see them like gerrymandering, Citizens United, voter suppression, and you also said, Mitch McConnell solved the problem of governance. So my question is, do you think are you convinced that the institutions, and I'm even thinking in particular the structure of, say, the Constitution, not on a really fundamental level, but I mean, are there any amendments that are needed or changes that are needed to address any of these issues? Do you think that as we are right now, if nothing changes, that things will in fact be able to improve?
Well, thanks. Yeah, so I hope that my message that came across wasn't that our current institutions are effective. My point was only that we could achieve a better mixed economy without the kind of fundamental constitutional reform that sometimes gets held up as the only path to economic redemption. And and in terms of McConnell, the point I was making is simply that McConnell realized that if the Republican Party was able to fail to cooperate. I mean, one way to think about this, I'm sorry to step back, but one way to think about this is, in a parliamentary system, right, at least in your idealized images, right, if you're the opposition, you're not in governance, right? But what the Republicans have been able to do is both be the loyal opposition, thus reaping the reward when governance is bad, and also to make governance nearly impossible, right? That combination is a toxic one. And so there are ways in which we can make that less possible. They're not easy, and they wouldn't necessarily, and I don't think they would probably, from a strategic standpoint, should involve constitutional amendments. So for one thing, as I said, is the degree to which you have two electorates, midterm and presidential election year electorates. Not to mention that filters down to the state level. Most governors are elected not in presidential election years. Where they are elected in presidential election years, Democrats are much more likely to win. So it's actually, I think, would be quite helpful to think about, okay, well, how do you make midterms and how do you make off-year elections a much higher turnout affairs? The other thing, as I said, is a lot of this is about outside organization and creation of constraint, right? So that our political system it's always required, and sometimes it's facilitated compromise. And it's facilitated compromise when there's these sources of outside constraint, right? That are, and as well as cross-cutting cleavages. And so trying to create that outside organizational constraint is important as well. One thing that I think would really help, and I just don't know exactly how to do it, is you've got to be able to have some kind of mechanisms and some kind of fora for calling out extremism, right? And let me just, think about would this election have been different because obviously the media said again and again, like, this is a reprehensible thing that Donald Trump has said or done. But would it have been different if instead of that, they had kept saying, Donald Trump is actually at odds with the Republican Party? And now he's not, right? Because he owns the Republican Party in a sense, right? He helped them, and of course, he doesn't own them in the sense that he's setting their agenda. Paul Ryan knows what he wants to do, but in the sense that, like, nothing succeeds like success, and they're much more likely to be allied with him as a result. But before the election, they were playing a very, very delicate double game, and it was, I think, greatly underreported, and especially among Republican voters, knowing the extent to which there was this divorce would have been important. And I think more generally, the accountability can't happen unless people have some basic idea of what's happening and who's responsible. So I think that kind of creating that is a difficult challenge, but it's one that doesn't require constitutional changes. If I had like a couple, constitutional amendments, well, I would be. I think the Electoral College is an anachronism. I'm not a big fan of the Senate, but that's basically beyond amendment. So we could talk about these things, but I actually think that, and it would be nice to have PR in some parts of the country, but proportional representation. But really, the truth is that in a lot of respects, these are extra institutional features, and even if you believe the institutions can be changed fundamentally, which I don't, that you could address these problems without doing so.
Jonathan Martin, sociologist from Framingham State University. I'm also contributing editor of the recent book, Empowering Progressive Third Parties in the United States, which is related to the question I'm going to ask you. So having read your book, Winner Take All Politics, I gather that you don't think the impetus for the kind of change you advocate is going to come from elites. You talk about the need for some kind of mass pressure to create a more active role for government in the economy. So where do you think the source of that is going to come from? That to me seems like the huge question here. From unions, they're small, they're representing a declining segment of the population, they're attached to a democratic establishment that's invested in the status quo, some kind of new social movement, maybe a new Occupy movement. We saw how that fizzled out. It had some effect, but in the end it was crushed. Is that going to inspire us? A Sanders-led uprising, yet he's up against the Democratic establishment, which is sitting on a mountain of cash and is invested in keeping things the way they are, or maybe some kind of a third-party force arising. Third parties did have some kind of an influence in pushing through critical democratic reforms in the 1800s and early 1900s. Do you foresee something like that coming about again? Where do you see the force, this mass pressure coming from to create the kind of change you're proposing?
Yeah, well, that is the big question. And let me just say, if we left the impression winner take all politics, that we don't think elites are a really important part of the solution as well as the challenge, then I wasn't clear enough. So it's the combination of elites that are constrained, right, by outside organization and mass pressure, and elite reformers that really makes these changes happen. And so I would say that the first order of business, right, would be like a serious internal challenge within the Democratic Party, but not so much on ideological grounds. Though I have, as we point out in the book, that the Democratic Party became deeply cross-pressured because of its increased reliance on money, but from the business community. But I actually think right now it's an organizationally inept party, right? It needs to get its act together, and so I'm not so much concerned about whether people are to the left of the party or the center, and I do think the party does need to stake out a more progressive vision in economic policy, but whether or not they can actually do things and build the kind of party that can compete nationally and pose and make their opponents, right, have to work for every victory in a way that makes them extremely vulnerable in future electoral contests. So that would be the immediate vision. On the longer term vision, you're absolutely right. I mean, I don't think, and I wish I could think, but I don't think that the traditional American Union, as we understood it for much of the 20th century, has a long future. I think it will kind of continue to have control in pockets of the economy, but there is no way, I think, to rebuild a broad working class, a middle class coalition without having some kind of organization that represents the economic interests of ordinary workers. And if it's not going to be traditional labor unions, what is it going to be? And I really don't know the answer to that question. I have seen some of the sources in the Fight for 15, in the ways in which it has involved cross-racial alliances. I would mention the Black Lives Matter movement as well. I've seen some of the potential for it in things that fall short of collective bargaining in kind of forms of worker representation that are consciousness raising and bring people together, and that use some digital technologies but are built ultimately on ground level organization and meetings. And finally, and I think, finally, I would say that I see this as, in part, a question of whether or not we're going to have a political movement and leadership, right, that is able to make this difficult case that combines a critique of the corruption and extremism of present government and a recognition of the essential role of government in achieving our prosperity. And that, if I was someone who could write slogans or craft effective political strategies, right, that's what I would try to do. I'm not. What I can say is that there is no future for progressivism in the United States that isn't also able and willing to embrace the active use of government in the 21st century. And so we're kind of at a Hamilton moment, if you will. And of course, we all know Alexander Hamilton. Back the Articles of Confederation, right, we remember the Constitution as being this, the revolution, and then the, Seinfeld style, we go revolution, yada, 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 Constitution, right? But there's like a big thing in the yada, yada, yada. That's the Articles of Confederation, the failure of institutional reform. I believe right now, if you look at the IRS, if you look at discretionary spending, if you look at all of these crucial areas of public authority, we're moving toward the kind of ineffective public authority that is corrupt and incapable. It's like the perfect negative combination. And that we cannot rebuild a strong and effective left or a strong and effective union movement without rebuilding a strong and effective government as well. So thank you.